So some of you might know this, but actually today, Charlene and I have been married 40 years. It's our 40th wedding anniversary. It's a long time. When you add in our years dating before we got married, we've been together more than we've lived more than twice as long as we were single people. So that's a long time. When you've been together this long, you know so much about each other. You know each other's stories. She's heard all of my jokes. She's heard me preach for 40 years. I mean, think about that. This poor woman has been subject to this all these years. And so I am constantly on the lookout for new material, to find something funny for her, to make her laugh, but that's a challenge sometimes. We know what is the strengths and weaknesses of each person, and she's told me that there are two things that I need to change, I need to work on. One is I need to listen better, and then the other is something else, I can't remember, but only two, just two. After couples have been together for many, many years, they know each other so well they can almost like complete each other's sentences, right? But if you know each other many, many years, you don't even have to speak, and you just know what the other person is thinking, right? You don't even have to talk. You just know what that person is thinking. Like just the other night, we were laying in bed together just before you fall asleep, and then Charlene rolls over, whispers in my ear, "You're wrong." Now, I really do want to say I'm so happy and blessed to be married to Charlene. We have a great relationship. We like to joke around. And one of the funniest jokes of everything is the fact that today, on our 40th wedding anniversary, just happens to be the day the sermon is about wives submitting to your husbands. Now, I did not plan this. You have to believe me, because that would assume that I do a good job of planning in advance, and that's not the case. But actually, I had a different schedule in mind, and then we had someone preach a couple weeks ago, and so it messed up everything. But so here we are, talking about wives submitting to their husbands. Now, I just to get serious for a minute, I believe this is a serious issue, because this passage talks about wives submitting to their husbands, male headship, and it also talks about slaves submitting to their masters, and this has probably caused more pain and more confusion and more caricatures of Christianity than many other passages in the New Testament. People have used this passage to justify abuse, control, silence. People have taken this, especially the slaves and masters stuff, and then used it to make the point that Christianity is outdated and irrelevant to our world today. And both reactions misunderstand, I believe, what Paul is really talking about, what's really going on in this passage. And I hope to make that clear today here. So let's look at each of these. There's three spheres of relationship where Paul talks about this: submit or obey. And let's just walk through them one by one, and there's, again, notes if you'd like to take them. And then we're going to talk about a couple of questions and concerns. So first, with regard to marriage, Paul advocates for love and respect. In fact, I'll just point this out. Paul's specific teaching about marriage, even though I have verse 21 listed as the first verse there, his teaching about marriage actually doesn't start until verse 22. Verse 21 is sort of like the topic sentence for this whole section, where he says to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And in fact, The word submit does not even occur in the Greek language in verse 22. It is drawn from verse 21. So the literal translation of verse 21 and 22 would go like this. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, wives to husbands as unto the Lord. So this whole section then is building off of this big topic sentence, which is submit to one another. And the idea of wives submitting to their husbands and the male headship is a offshoot of this fundamental principle of mutual submission that reverence for Christ produces in all of us. And in fact, it's part of then also parents and children and masters and slaves, which we'll get to a little bit later. So there are real differences in role. There is submission, but it doesn't mean that anyone in this passage, husband, parent, master, gets to treat their position as a license for simple self-interest. In fact, to make this even more clear in this situation with husbands and wives, the Greek word for submit here is hypotasso or hypotasso. I believe in the Greek you'd pronounce it hypotasso. And that literally means to place yourself under, to place yourself in a certain position. It would be like, it was a military term actually, where you would place yourself in a position with regard to your superior in the rank. The literal translation or the literal definition of that word in Greek commentaries or Greek dictionaries would be to place yourself under someone, to come alongside them in a supportive and non-competitive posture. All right, that's what hypotasso means. It's different than obey. Obey is hypakuo, and that's the word that Paul uses when he talks about parents and children, that children obey their parents. And so wives should arrange themselves in this way of submission to their husbands, just as they place themselves in that position with regard or in their relationship with Christ. And of course, that then raises a whole set of questions about how this can work when you have husbands that are not at all leading like Jesus, right? So that's where we get to verses 25 through 20, and following. Husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, scholars remind us that this was very unusual, unprecedented, unheard of in Greek and Roman household codes to tell husbands what to do in this relationship, to tell husbands to love their wives, let alone love their wives sacrificially. It's not just about providing and protecting. There's a standard that Paul is raising here of self-giving, self-emptying love like Christ had for the church that brought him to the cross. And then he goes even further in verses 28 and 29, pushes this even further by saying to love your wife as your own body, nourishing and cherishing her just like you would care for yourself. So the whole focus of the teaching towards husbands is for them to focus on their wives' flourishing, not their own power or authority or convenience. Put this another way, headship in this passage is defined by sacrifice, not authority. It's about that orientation of the heart, not so much about a position of power. Then in verses 31 to 32, Paul goes on to talk about this and relate this to the mystery of husbands and wives joining and becoming one, which is a quotation from the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 2, going back to creation, and comparing that then to Christ being united to people through the Holy Spirit in the members of the church. And so all of this is to say that this raises the stakes for us as Christians for how husbands and wives treat each other. It either displays or distorts the gospel to our watching world. Well, then how does this play out, right? What does it look like? It looks different in different relationships. Can I just say that again? It looks different in different relationships. I've had a few wives over the years as I've been a pastor, come to me expressing frustration. What's that? Have I said I had a few wives come to me? To be clear, not my wife, okay? These were not my wives. These were wives of other husbands who came to me expressing their frustration because their husband was not being the spiritual leader that he should be. And I remember this early on in my ministry, there was a woman who was like very, very strong person, just took over every room she was in. And she came to me and said, my husband is just not the spiritual leader. How can I submit to him? How can I respect him? He's not being the spiritual leader that he needs to be. And I knew her pretty well. Wouldn't normally do this, but I was very direct with her. And I said, look, you are such a strong personality. The Apostle Paul could be married to you, and you would not think he was a good enough spiritual leader. Different couples, it's going to play out differently based on how your personalities come together. I'm going to put it this way, and this is actually what has been the bottom line for Charlene and me, and how as I've talked about this with other couples struggling, because I've also had a number of husbands come to me and express frustration because their wives are so contrary and pushy and manipulative, right? And so this passage is not easy. We are sinful, broken people. And some of us grew up in homes that had terrible models of healthy relationships, and we're figuring this out. So nobody in this room is married to a perfect spouse, except maybe Charlene. No, I'm kidding. Nobody is married to a perfect spouse, and no one is a perfect spouse. And so how does this play out? Early in ministry, another couple that I talked to, that I felt like they just had a really great relationship. I was actually preaching on this passage back then, and I talked to them about this passage. How does this work? Because she also was quite strong personality, and the husband said, how does this work in your relationship? The husband said, we decided early on that when we disagreed about something and we couldn't come to an agreement, we'd figure out who actually knew more about the issue, and we'd go with that person's opinion. And so I like that approach. And if we ultimately can't break it down, then we've said we would go with my view on it as a husband. But work as hard as you can to come to agreement. If you can't come to agreement, then figure out who knows more about it than the other and go with that opinion. I mean, it's not about you being the master, the power broker in the relationship. So here's some questions to think about. Oh, yeah, let's not forget this passage. Take this approach. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. You know, if we would just do this, if we just meditated on this, really worked on this, I think a lot of things would change in our relationships. So, husbands, a couple of questions. What would it look like this week for husbands if you would just notice something your wife needs and give it to her before she asks? How about trying that? And wives, is there an area in your relationship where you're withholding respect? Is it because of how you're being treated? Is there something else going on? And how can we grow in these areas? So that's husbands and wives, and there's questions about this we're going to come back to. Let's move on to the second area, which is family, parents and children. Verse 1 of chapter 6 says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." And once again, to get back to this theme of these words being revolutionary for their time, Paul speaking to children as capable of moral choice, worthy of being addressed this way, very unusual in Greco-Roman household instruction. Other household codes basically treated children as property or like slaves. Their own feelings or decisions were not even considered. And here, kids are told to obey their parents and obey their parents in the Lord. In other words, that this command is grounded in something, in their relationship with Christ. It's grounded in something deeper than just respect for their parents for its own sake. And then he calls to mind Exodus 20, the fifth commandment in the Old Testament, which is to honor your father and mother, which comes with a promise, if you honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God gives you. So there's two words that are being brought up here. One is, children, obey your parents, and then the fifth commandment is to honor your parents. There's a lot of overlap there, but the one distinction would be obedience is an issue for younger children under the care and protection of their parents. And then as you grow, honoring our parents is for all ages. Even after you've grown up and left the nest, you may not obey them, or need to obey them in that same way, but you still honor them. And the promise is that it may go well with you, and you may live long in the land. Now, that's not a magic formula, but it does point to something very real. Families that are ordered around honor tend to do well. Families marked by contempt tend to struggle and fracture. But of course, a big part of whether there is obedience and honoring has a lot to do with how parents parent, how they exercise their authority. So Paul goes on to give instructions to fathers, again, unusual in that time. He's actually giving instructions to fathers about how to parent. And probably he addresses just fathers here because fathers were the legal authority in Roman households, but this is true for moms as well. Parents, do not provoke your children to anger. And we provoke our children to anger by harsh discipline, by giving them impossible standards to meet, by favoritism, by inconsistency, by using shame as a tool of manipulation. Authority exercised without love. Authority exercised without relationship. And the positive alternative is to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. In other words, not just about exercising discipline, but teaching them, instructing them, relational and spiritual shaping. Now, I know this issue of parenting is it's a source of a lot of debate and, conflict today about how you parent. There is gentle parenting on the bottom right, where you don't really discipline them, but there's a lot of nurture, right? Just encourage them. You're doing a great job. Oh, great job for stopping hitting your sister, right? Whatever. Then there's authoritarian parenting, where there's a lot of discipline but no love and no support. Then there's absentee parenting, where you're not really doing much of either because you're just either gone or distracted or whatever. And then there is healthy and engaged parenting, where there is discipline and nurture. So some questions for you. Parents, is there a pattern in how you discipline your kids that's more about your own frustration than your child's actual formation? What would it look like this week, parents, if you would actively disciple your kids spiritually and not just assume it's just going to happen or that the church is going to do it, but that it's part of your call as a parent? And children and kids that are here, how are you honoring your parents? What does that mean for you to honor your parents? Not just obeying them, but actively honoring them. Okay, the third sphere of relationship is slaves and masters. Slaves serve as unto the Lord. Verse 5 of chapter 6. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So Paul, speaking directly to slaves here, is again, just like with kids and parents, unusual for his time to be addressing slaves and giving them this kind of spiritual instruction and exhortation. And basically treating slaves and masters alike in that they're both needing spiritual instruction here. Verse 6, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. The motivation is not punishment, but it's identity, your identity as a follower of Christ. And then verse 8 promises that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether slave or free. Everyone's actual work is seen and rewarded by God, which again levels the playing field, slaves, masters alike. So keep this in mind, we're going to come back to it, but this is counsel for people who are living inside of a unjust institution that they didn't choose and they really can't escape. But how do you live in it? Paul is not endorsing slavery here. He's helping people to learn how to live within it. And then comes the wild part, is verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Paul applies the same posture, service, integrity, doing the will of God from the heart, to the master that he applied to the slave. Do not threaten them, which was the primary tool of motivation for slaves, was physical violence. Since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. Now, that sentence is part of what brought slavery down. Because if master and slave answer to the same heavenly master, if they've all got a heavenly master, the same master who shows no favoritism, then the whole hierarchy of owner and owned breaks apart theologically. Combine this with the seed that Paul plants in the New Testament book of Philemon, right? So here Paul is saying this, that slave and master have the same master. There's no favoritism that this master offers. And then add in the book of Philemon in the New Testament, where Paul asks a slave owner to receive a runaway slave back to him. This is quoting from verse 16, to receive this slave no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. So the common thread here in this passage is that everyone answers to the same master, whether husband or wife, child or parent, slave or master. Every single relationship in these groupings, it gets reoriented around this reality that we are all followers of and servants of Christ, and he does not show favoritism. So that's what makes the passage subversive. That's what plants the theological dynamite here that eventually blew apart the slavery in a couple centuries ago. Now, for us today, we often apply this teaching to the relationship between employees and employers. And maybe it feels like it, but they're obviously different. They're not the same kind of relationship. Slavery involved the ownership of persons, a certain level of control that's not there. But the heart posture, there's a lot about this. The way that we serve, the reason that we serve, applies to employer-employee relationships. So some questions to think about here. Employees, does your work ethic change based on whether or not your boss is watching? What would this idea of serving as if you were serving the Lord, what would that look like in how you do your work this week? And employers, do you treat everyone under your authority with the same dignity, regardless of their position or background or how useful they are to you? Or is favoritism creeping in? Okay, so before we close, though, I want to address a couple of questions that always come up with this passage and are important to deal with. We just need to deal with them before we close today. So the first one is, what's cultural here and what's universal? This passage has forced the church throughout the centuries to wrestle with a very difficult question as we read the Bible and try to translate it and interpret it for our own context. What it was just about that culture for that time, and what is universal for all cultures for all times. How does this apply to us today? Because if you know your history, you know that in the 1800s, in the South, there were many slave owners who were saying, look, the Bible clearly defends and advocates for slavery. The Bible clearly teaches that slavery is legitimate, and it tells slaves to obey their earthly masters. Just look at Ephesians 6, right? That's what they were saying. And the abolitionists answered, and we believe today that Paul was giving specific instructions for people living in a world that the way it was structured, the way it existed, and how do you live within that? And then within that teaching, planted seeds of undermining the whole institution itself. Now, why didn't he just say slavery should just be abolished, slaves, you should be free? Remember that Christianity, when Paul was writing it, was a small persecuted minority under Jewish and Roman authority, being persecuted. There was no way that the early church could even think about overturning an institution like slavery. All that Paul could do was to teach people how to live faithfully within that system. So that's a cultural question with regard to slavery. But what about the cultural question with regard to the role of husbands and wives? Wives submitting to husbands. Does the same logic apply here? Well, this is a big topic with a lot of nuance, and if you want to dig deeper, I invite you to come on Wednesday night. We will have a Q&A gathering. We'll have our dinner together and then Q&A times. We can talk about it more. But for now, I do want to make one distinction. When Paul talks about husbands and wives, that relationship, he connects that to creation, and he connects it to the relation between Christ and the church. So he grounds this connection or this relationship with the created order, Genesis 2, about man and wife, leaving husband and wife being joined together, and about how it's like submitting to Christ, the church submitting to Christ. He doesn't do that at all when he's talking about slaves and masters. He doesn't appeal to creation, doesn't compare the master-slave relationship to Christ and the church. So in church history, especially like Reformed scholars have always made this distinction between what they called creation ordinances and structural or social ordinances, social structures. And so creation are things that go back to how God put the world together, and that would be things like marriage, the structure of work and rest, that's part of the Sabbath. And then other social structures are part of the broken world that we're living in, institutions like slavery and government systems. And this is why no serious scholar or Christian tradition defends slavery as biblically mandated, while at the same time, many Christian traditions still affirm a headship role between husbands and wives, between men and women. But once again, even saying that, I want to point out again how careful we need to be in living this out, applying this, especially husbands, especially when you look at all that Paul tells husbands to do and how they should treat their wives. Which brings us to the second important question, which is, what about abusive relationships? What about a relationship where the person that you're under their authority is trying to make you do something evil? Must we submit to abusive or evil in relationships? And the answer is a clear and unequivocal no. This passage never asks anyone to submit to abuse. Submission in Ephesians 5 exists inside a structure of mutual submission, sacrificial love, and reverence for Christ. It's never a blank check for anyone in authority to just do whatever they want. Every instruction about submission is paired with an equal and even stronger instruction for the person in authority. Husbands to love sacrificially, fathers to not provoke and to train and discipline and disciple their kids, masters to stop threatening and remember that they're under the same master. So when someone in authority abandons their side through abuse, cruelty, exploitation, they've broken this very structure that Paul is setting up. And so they don't get to invoke submission while disobeying everything else that they're supposed to be protecting. So Scripture consistently draws a line between godly authority and tyranny. When Peter and the apostles were commanded to not preach the gospel, they just disobeyed, and they responded by saying, we must obey God rather than men. That's Acts chapter 5. Human authority is never absolute in Scripture. It's always accountable to a higher authority. So, let's put it this way. If someone in your life is using their position, spouse, parent, employer, even church leadership, to harm you, this passage does not obligate you to stay silent, to stay in danger, to keep submitting to that harm. Seeking safety, bringing in people you trust, leaving a dangerous situation, this is living out what Ephesians 5 actually looks like. It follows the whole logic of this passage, which never grants authority the right to hurt people under its care. Okay, now just add one other thing, just my own personal observation over many years of working with couples and many years also doing consulting with other leaders and churches in conflict. I'll put it this way. The more someone in authority has to talk about their authority and has to keep reminding people that they need to submit, usually that means that they're not very qualified to do it. You know, the more you have to use Scripture to browbeat people into submission, the more that should tell you that you need to look in the mirror and that you're probably not being the kind of husband or parent or manager or leader that you need to be. Jesus said it very plainly in Matthew 20. He said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and husbands lord it over their spouses. Parents lord it over their kids. Managers, employers lord it over their. Not so with you. Instead, Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Yes, of course there's authority. Of course there's authority. But when it comes paired with integrity and these relationship care that Paul is talking about, then that authority actually can work in a healthy way. Okay, so these three spheres of relationship. Where do we go from here? Every relationship in this passage, marriage, parenting, work, gets the same treatment. Authority is real, but it's a different kind of authority than we generally see. So I'm going to leave with three very specific applications and sort of where we go from here. First, in your role as a leader, wherever you have authority, reflect this week on this question. Am I using my influence to serve or to be served? In your role, if you're in roles where you are a follower, where you're under someone, you're called to submit to someone else, is my posture rooted in reverence for Christ, or simply am I just trying to get by out of fear? And then if there's anyone here who's in an abusive situation, or something that we've talked about brings up some very painful things, is there someone you need to reach out to? Trusted counselor, pastor, someone this week, please do that.